Well, welcome everyone to another session here at the 36th annual NOFA Mass Winter Conference. My name is Aaron Guman. I'm the Farm Resilience Specialist at NOFA Vermont, and I am calling in virtually here, as is obvious, from North Central Vermont, where we went from mud season to frozen season this morning, and I'm just sort of our little virtual host here. And I just have a couple slides here, and then we'll get started. This is we are sorry, here we go. Okay, so this is a land acknowledgement that the land that this conference is physically taking place on was inhabited by the Nipmuc people prior to European colonization. And there's some more information on that at this link, which I will drop into the chat as soon as I pass the mic over to our main presenter, Sara, here. We are centering racial equity in the food system as part of the conference. And there's a bunch of organizations here that folks can look to for more information. Centering racial equity in your own communities can mean many things, including protecting the rights of farm and food workers, supporting legislation to advance the work of reparations, land reparations, and also to support BIPOC-led organizations through sharing land, money, equipment, and connections. I will drop some links in the chat for that for anyone interested. And we also have a bunch of generous sponsors of the conference, and there is information about them online. And we have some great items also in the online auction, which is helping raise some money to support NOFA Mass further. And I'll drop some links in the chat to those. And without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Sara Davis from Hollow Livestock in Shelburne, Mass, who made the wintry trip down to share with us all about raising rabbits for improved self-sufficiency.
Thank you so much, Aaron. So I am Sara Davis, and our farm is Hollow Livestock. And as Aaron mentioned, we're in Shelburne, Massachusetts. We raise a variety of different livestock. In our farm, we started in 2006, but my husband and I both grew up on farms in rural Western Massachusetts anyway. So we have quite a bit of experience with different livestock. We had added rabbits to our farm. We have both mini Rex and American chinchillas. The American chinchillas are a meat and pelt rabbit that we raise for those purposes, and also we show and sell quite a bit of breeding stock. And then my kids show the mini Rex, both in 4-H and sanctioned shows, and sell quite a few as pets and breeders for other folks. So we've been doing the rabbits on our farm for, where are we at, about 3.5 years now. But I grew up raising rabbits and in 4-H and showing, and so have a pretty lengthy experience with different breeds of rabbits for different purposes. So thank you for joining us today. The presentation that I'm doing today is about raising rabbits and how that can help improve our self-sufficiency on our farms. And I'm just going to hopefully be able to figure out how to advance my slides. So the main reason that I feel like rabbits can be an integral part to a small farm or homestead is that they are an extremely sustainable source of meat, and they're very accessible. And so rabbit meat is sometimes called the other white meat. And so, you know, rabbit meat is an excellent substitute for chicken or pork. It's an all white meat, so there's no dark meat in it. It's very fine grained, and it's got a very almost sweet flavor, but very much like chicken, but a little bit denser texture. And it's higher in protein, so it's 21% protein, where chicken is a 20% protein. Beef is 16 and 13% in pork, just for comparison. So it actually is a very high protein meat to add to your diet. There's less fat, cholesterol, and fewer calories than the other meat options that are out there. And one thing to note with that is actually, if your main protein is rabbit, you have to add other fats to your diet, because your body does need different fats in order to, be healthy and for neurological function. And so there are some cases where folks have eaten exclusively rabbit and not gotten enough fat. And so that's something to keep in mind if rabbit does become a big part of your diet.
It's raising high quality food.
This is raising rabbits. That's okay. So why would you choose to raise rabbits for meat instead of another livestock? Beef is obviously one of your most common protein sources that's raised on a farm. Pork and chicken are right up there as well, but a lot of folks are moving towards rabbits, and there's some good reasons for that. It gives us control over our food supply, is sort of one of the main reasons that a lot of people like it, especially after the pandemic, where folks were having a hard time sourcing good food. A lot of folks started branching out and saying, well, I could raise rabbits in the space that I have and make sure that our family always has access to meat, that we know, we have control of their diet, their medications, their environment, their care, all these other pieces that make us feel like the meat that we're eating is raised in a way that, we can feel good about. Rabbits are quiet, so they don't make noise the way that sheep or goats or cattle or pigs do. A lot of people can keep them in areas where you couldn't keep other livestock because they're not technically classified as livestock by the USDA. And so you can keep them in suburban areas. A lot of people will keep them in a garage and their neighbors don't even know. And so you're able to raise your own meat source in a way that's very discreet. They're a very efficient meat source. So one breeding doe can produce over 300 pounds of actual edible meat in a year. If you compare that to a cow, if she has one calf, a cow has one calf in a year, you're looking at about a 400-pound 1 year growth on that calf, which when you butcher it is only about 200 pounds of meat. And so actually you can produce more meat from one rabbit than one beef in a 1 year period. And obviously in a much smaller space. So, and one doe will take with her kits, about 20 square feet of space. You certainly couldn't raise 300 pounds of any other, more traditional livestock in 20 square feet and get 300 pounds of meat. They have extremely high feed efficiency. So for every 4 pounds of feed you feed to a rabbit, you get a pound of meat. Cattle is generally more like 7 or 8 pounds per pound of gain. I think one of the only ones, I think pigs are at 3 to 1. Fish are basically the best when you're looking at animals to raise for meat, but obviously are a lot more complicated to raise than rabbits. But 4 pounds to 1 pound of gain is definitely one of the most efficient meat producing animals to be raised. They also have a higher meat to bone ratio than chicken. So if you have a 5-pound dressed rabbit and a 5-pound dressed chicken, you'll end up with more meat off of the rabbit, and for less money and in less space, and much less mess and smell and noise. So a lot of people have started moving towards rabbits for meat just because there are so many benefits there. Another reason that people raise rabbits, and usually it goes with the meat, obviously, is your pelts. And so rabbit pelts are extremely soft, very warm, very lightweight. The skin can be a little delicate. And so, you're not going to want to use them for high wear things, but things like mittens, hats, exterior fur or interior fur coats, things like that. They can be wonderful and warm and come in a variety of colors and patterns and textures. Everything from, what you think of as a wild rabbit pelt, where, it's sort of hairy and brown, to a Rex pelt, where it feels like velveteen and plush. And they, like I said, they come in all different colors. And so they're something that can be processed at home. You don't have to send them out. It's something that is accessible to process in your own space. And a lot of people do different crafts and things with them as well and create a revenue stream.
Are they easier to tan than say other?
They're smaller. They're smaller, and so from that perspective, yes, easier. They can be a little bit more delicate. And so when you're actually breaking the hide after you've tanned it, and it starts to dry a little bit, you have to stretch out the skin side. And so when you break it, you just have to be more careful that you don't rip a hole in it. But yeah, I would say easier is probably an accurate assumption. Another way that I've seen people use it is to actually take a pelt and you can cut essentially a 1-inch strip and make a spiral all the way to the middle. And then you can twist it and dry it that way and use it as a yarn. And so instead of having a full pelt, you can actually, knit with it or weave with it or do all sorts of other things. Yeah.
When you do that, is it possible to keep the hair, fur,
Yeah.
fur? Is it possible to keep the fur on it?
Yeah. So the question, just for folks at home, if you can't hear, we have an attendee here who asked if we can keep the fur on it when we do that. And yeah, absolutely. You can cut strips in it. Typically people will use like an X-Acto knife so you don't cut the hair. And then you twist it, you dry it, and actually what'll happen is the skin side will shrink down. And so it'll seem like the fur is all the way around. So it's really cool. It gives a lot of different options for things that you can do with it. Angora fiber is something that is one of the sort of most fine, warmest, softest, lightest fibers out there. Depending on the breed of rabbit, you can get up to 4 pounds of fiber from one rabbit in 1 year. And this is something where you either, depending on the breed, you either pluck the hair, the Angora fiber off of them, or you clip them, shear them a couple of times a year. And so that'll depend on breed, whether they shed or not. But you can certainly do that. And, it doesn't involve obviously anything traumatic for the rabbit. And so, if you want something that you can have one rabbit and make a sweater and a hat and a pair of mittens, one Angora rabbit will make enough fiber for you to do that. And so there's different breeds. Probably the most popular breed for more commercial type production is going to be your giant Angoras or your German Angoras. Your German Angoras are around a 10-pound rabbit, sometimes a little bigger. So they're very big. They have to be shorn. They don't shed their fiber, but they can grow up to 4.5 pounds of Angora fiber in 1 year on one rabbit, which is just incredible production compared to sheep or other, wool-bearing animals. In the States, typically, if people have Angora rabbits at home, most people have French Angoras. And they tend to run between 7.5 and 10.5 pounds. And you can actually just pluck the fur from them. It'll shed when they molt. And so you'll pull it out similar to you would with a dog when they shed their coat out. And so you don't actually have to clip them, their whole body. You can just pluck it out and spin it right from the animal. You don't need to do any additional washing because it doesn't have lanolin in it like sheep's wool does. And then the French Angoras in particular are not prone to matting either, but most people do clean up around their faces and their vent area and their legs just so they don't get any fecal material or anything sort of stuck in there. But your French Angoras will make about 1 pound a year, which is still a pretty significant amount of fiber, coming off of a 8 to 10 pound rabbit. So Angora rabbits do require a little bit special care compared to other rabbits. A lot of the breeds that need to be shorn, you'll need either a set of clippers or scissors and some skill and learning how to do that. A lot of people will use a blower for grooming instead of a brush, because if you brush them, it'll actually damage the fibers a little bit every time. Or if you use a blower, it'll blow all the dander and dust out and actually keep everything clean in the periods between harvesting. A couple of things, Angoras have unique health concerns. So they do often require sanitary trims, like I mentioned, because they do grow a lot of fiber. And if you don't do the sanitary trims, they will try to groom themselves. And because there's so much hair, they can end up with wool block, which is similar to a hairball in a cat, except rabbits can't actually pop up the hairball. And so it can actually cause a blockage within the rabbit. And so staying up on grooming is very important to keep them healthy. In the summer, they can be more prone to heat stress, just they're carrying a big blanket. And so that's something to be aware of. And one thing that's interesting with the Angora rabbits is actually cull Angora rabbits can make really good commercial rabbits. So you could have a combination of meat and Angora if that's something that you wanted to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be a choice of one or the other. Fertilizer. Okay, rabbit manure is one of the very best fertilizers out there. It is more nutrient dense than essentially any other manure source. It has 4 times more nutrients than cow and horse manure in it, and twice as much as chicken manure, which is typically thought of as, you know, really strong. But one of the biggest things with rabbit manure is that it's a cold manure. So you can take it directly from underneath your rabbit cage and put it on your plants immediately.
Really?
You don't have to compost it. You don't have to dilute it into a tea. You can just lay it out, and it comes in little dry pellets. They don't smell. They're, you know, dry, and so they don't cause a mess. And you can put it directly on your plants. In this picture that I have in the background, if you can see, on the left-hand side of the screen, right about in the middle, the left-hand side was all rabbit manure underneath, and the right-hand side was just a typical compost. And you can see at the bottom, I don't know how well you can see it on the screen, but the ones on the right are obviously much less full of a plant, but also they're yellowing at the bottom. They don't have as much nutrition coming in. And otherwise, these plants were planted at the same time, you know, the same weather, everything was the same. And this was just not a planned experiment, but something we did in our garden where we had spread out some rabbit manure on one side and just saw a huge difference. And so part of that is that rabbit manure is really beneficial to soil microorganisms. And so there's a lot there that feeds your different fungi and bacteria in the soil. Earthworms absolutely love rabbit manure. And working rabbit manure into the soil will actually improve your soil structure and your water retention. And so all those things together just make it a wonderful fertilizer, whether you're growing food, flowers, you know, marijuana, whatever you're growing, there's not much that's going to be better than rabbit manure. This is our daughter showing she showed one of her rabbits and got a big trophy. And so I took a picture, but a lot of people show rabbits, and there are a lot of different reasons to show rabbits. You know, if you've got kids at home, which is why we sort of added rabbits in to start with and then expanded it. Rabbits make an excellent youth project. They are very easy to care for. You know, even young children with a little bit of, you know, supervision and support can take care of rabbits. You know, they're very, very low maintenance. They're small size, depending on the breed that you get. But, you know, kids love handling the babies. You know, they start off real small and cute, no matter how big the rabbit's going to be. And you can spend a lot of time with the rabbits. And, you know, it teaches the kids a lot of responsibility and a lot of, you know, learning about development of different animals and sort of compassion for the animals that they're raising. And we found, you know, that we really like having our kids involved with it because it's something they can really take ownership of on our farm, that they can, you know, raise from a day old all the way up and show it and do everything with it, which has just been a great experience. There's a big network of both ARBO, which is the American Rabbit Breeder Association. They have a network of shows. And then there are local shows and fairs and things like that. There are over 50 recognized breeds. Each has their own standard of perfection that you're breeding towards and their own, you know, size limits and fur types and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity to select which breed you're interested in.
How do the breeds compare with wild rabbits?
So yeah, the question was about the breeds and how they compare with wild rabbits. Wild rabbits are actually not even the same species as domestic rabbits in the United States. So our rabbits that we had, aside from hares, our rabbits in the United States actually are descendants of European rabbits, which are not able to interbreed with wild American rabbits. And so that's something that people don't always realize. But your wild rabbits are typically all about the same color, that sort of wild type brown color. They're much smaller. There's not really much meat on them. You know, they're built for survival and not much else. And so, you know, there's not a lot of comparability between them aside from they sort of look similar. They're both rabbits in some respects. One nice thing with the showing, even if you don't have kids or they're not involved, or, you know, you're not necessarily someone who wants to go from show to show, it is nice sometimes to take your rabbits out if they meet one of the breed standards and get an objective evaluation from a trained judge who can say, this meat conformation is better than that. This animal is going to have more meat production through the areas that are economically important when you're raising meat. And so having that evaluation can be really valuable as a breeder to know which animals to keep as you select your next generation.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Just to go back to the manure really quick.
Yeah.
What's the rate of application for that? Like, do you just do your bed do you just do your bed like once a year, or do you do it more often, and how much? Or is it
Yeah,
just
so
really-
Yeah, so the question has to do with how much manure basically to put on and how often. And, really it's going to depend on what kind of plants you're growing. Your ones that are more hungry plants, if you're growing tomatoes, you could use a whole lot more and get more benefit. For example, but, you could really, what we typically do just for time management is typically we put it out once a year. And then if we see some plants that are looking a little bit sad, we'll top dress it or work it into the soil just a little bit. I don't have specific rates, off the top of my head, but you can't really over apply it either, compared to some of the other manures. So hopefully that helps. I know it's not that specific of an answer, but
Yeah, thank you.
but you can plant. Yeah, you can plant directly in the rabbit manure. It doesn't have to necessarily be mixed with something else. And so, over application isn't so much a worry. Yeah. So maybe you want to get rabbits, right? Because I've been really convincing, obviously. Everybody needs them. So where do you start? Everybody says, okay, I want rabbits. And then they sort of go, well, now what do I do? There's all these questions and all these options. And, the first thing I would say is set your goals. What's your purpose in having the rabbits? Pick what your really goals are. Do you want to produce the best meat rabbits you can? Are you looking for the best pelts you can get? Do you want to just have a couple of fiber rabbits? Or maybe fiber rabbits that produce meat rabbits? Do you want to show and really specialize in improving a particular breed? Do you want to produce as much fertilizer as you possibly can? Or maybe a combination of different things? And so knowing those things will help you know what breeds you should be looking towards, and what type of rabbits you should look towards. Knowing sort of what number of rabbits you think you want to start with. The saying is they breed like rabbits. And so if you start with 3 rabbits, you could easily have 30 rabbits very quickly. And so knowing where you want to get to will help you know where to start. There are different breeds that are very popular for meat in the United States. So New Zealand's and Californians are probably the 2 biggest, most popular meat breeds, the more commercial type rabbits. They produce a white pelt, which can obviously be dyed or anything else. And they tend to be very consistent. Other breeds that are more popular with homesteaders and smaller farmers include your Rex rabbits. And so they have that real satiny, soft pelt. And so a lot of people raise a dual purpose rabbit that's a Rex that has both a really soft, nice pelt and also very productive meat rabbit. We raise American chinchillas, which are a heritage breed of meat rabbit, and they're a meat and pelt rabbit as well. Other breeds include satin, silver fox, champagne d'Argents, Florida whites, which are just a little bit smaller but very efficient meat rabbits. And a lot of people raise mixes of different breeds. And I'll say some of the best meat rabbits you get may be mixes, but when you're producing them, you probably want to start with 2 parents that are purebred and actually produce your own mixes, because when you're breeding rabbits that are mixes, you don't always know what you're going to get. When the babies come out, they may tend towards more to one side than the other. And so I typically recommend trying to stick with animals that are more towards purebred type, even if you don't have a pedigree on them. When you're looking for where to get your rabbits, network with as many people as you can. There are so many people out there raising rabbits. There's lots of ways to get to them. If you're on Facebook, social media, there's all kinds of groups where folks connect over rabbits. Obviously, American Rabbit Breeder Association, Livestock Breed Conservancy, if you're looking for a heritage breed. And then there's individual breed clubs as well. So if you're interested in a certain breed, you can join that breed club and actually figure out who's close by and meet some people and learn how they do things and what they look for. Maybe you'll connect with somebody and be able to select someone who's going to be your mentor as you choose your rabbits, which is definitely helpful. One thing that I recommend is when you do finally decide to get your rabbits, I recommend buying from one breeder. And there's a lot of benefits to that. To me, you're going to get the most consistent babies if all your rabbits come from the same genetic sort of pool. And also you reduce your risk of disease transmission. So if you buy one rabbit here and one rabbit there and one rabbit here, you don't know if they're all been exposed to the same diseases. And so you may end up getting the other ones sick with something they've never been exposed to before.
You don't get into vaccinations and stuff, do you, with rabbits?
The question was about vaccinations, and there are no vaccines that are typically recommended for rabbits. The only vaccine that folks have started using for rabbits is for rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, which is a fairly new endemic disease that's fortunately so far mostly in the west and Midwest and southern part of the country. Hopefully it won't make it up here. It's basically like Ebola in rabbits. It's really bad. There is a vaccine for that, but that's a new thing that people are starting to use that typically wouldn't have been recommended before a couple of years ago when we started this outbreak. So really there are no vaccines that you would use in the Northeast that, you know, for your rabbits. So selection, how do you pick the right rabbits? I mean, there's so many choices. And so when you start, I always recommend to people starting out to get a breeding trio. And what that means is one breeding male, and whether he's mature or not, you know, a male that's going to be used as your sire, and then 2 females. And I like to see people get 1 female that's experienced if they can, instead of 2 young females, just because first-time moms aren't always the best with rabbits because they do have so many babies and so many litters over their lifetime. The first litter doesn't always make it. And so for folks who are just starting out, I like to recommend that they get 1 female who's experienced so that their first litter isn't a complete loss if that, you know, if they bred both females that had never been bred before. Understanding sort of conformation for whatever your purpose is, I'm going to say meat, because to me that, you know, is a huge selling point of rabbits. And so understanding meat conformation and type and, you know, what a good meat rabbit looks like and feels like, you want to really get your hands on that animal and feel that they're nice and full through the loin and that their rear legs are nice and fleshy, and their shoulders, and really just know that it's not just fuzz with a skinny rabbit underneath, because you want a nice, healthy, full rabbit. You know, wherever you're buying your rabbits, ask questions. Ask questions about growth rates, about reproductive traits, about the health or temperament of the animals that you're looking at. Really, you know, a good breeder shouldn't be worried about answering your questions. You know, they should answer whatever questions you have because they're going to want you to get the rabbits that are going to fit your situation.
Reproductive traits, you mean the traits that actually tend to get passed?
Yeah, by reproductive traits, what I actually, in my mind, what I was thinking was, you know, how good a mother is she? How many babies do they usually have? How many do they usually raise to weaning? You know, you could have a great doe that has 2 babies every time, and that's not going to be nearly as productive for you as a doe that has 10 babies and raises them all every time. And so I'm thinking more of, you know, what is her reproductive rate going to be like? How many babies are you going to get if you know, get females from this line? Because those traits do tend to be genetic. Let's see. And then that mentor that you might have found as a result of our last slide when you were doing your networking, consider asking them for some help, because when you go look at rabbits, first of all, you're going to see them and want them all, right? If you are looking for rabbits. And second of all, you're not necessarily going to see the minor differences between rabbits that are all the same color and size and rough shape, you know, as someone who's new to it. So asking someone with experience to help you is definitely going to pay off in the long run. And when you go to pick out your rabbits or to visit people's barns, if you're considering getting rabbits, you want to pay attention to what you're seeing in their barn. You know, are the animals overall clean? Are they in good shape? Do you see a bunch of rabbits that are really thin or that have, you know, watery eyes? Are they sneezing? Are they missing pieces of their ears? Are, you know, as you look at them, really just notice the things that are visible to you. And that'll tell you a lot about the management of those animals and the health of those animals. Look at their cage condition. Do they have food and water available? Do they have a big buildup of poop in the corner where they could be ingesting different things that could make them sick? Healthy animals are going to be alert. They're going to have healthy coats. They're going to have clear eyes, and they're going to have dry noses. They're not going to be sneezing. If you see any of those things, you probably don't want to buy animals from there, because you're just setting yourself up to have to try to fix something instead of starting with healthy animals. If you're buying purebred animals, pedigreed animals, then you want to notice if the animals are tattooed, and they'll be tattooed in the left ear if they're keeping pedigrees on them typically. And so, notice if their animals are tattooed if you're looking for animals with pedigrees that are tracked. So you found your rabbits and you want to bring them home. And you've got to figure out where you're going to put them. So there's lots of different choices for housing. Rabbits are in some ways very fragile, but for environment, they're actually very rugged. They can handle very cold temperatures. And, they actually are much hardier than a lot of people think they are, being such a small animal. But remember, they're carrying around that coat all the time that's really warm. And so cold is not typically an issue for them. Typically, actually, heat is a harder issue for rabbits. They can actually overheat. And so when you're looking for a location, it can be outside. It doesn't have to be in your garage or your basement or anything like that. You can have them in an enclosed building. If you do that, make sure there's good ventilation. And also think about the lighting. Rabbits that get fewer than 12 hours of light in a day are not going to breed well. And so that's something to think about if you have them in a garage or something like that, is you may need to provide some artificial light.
So you could use like grow lights.
Yeah, even just regular lights. Yeah. Because it's really just sort of stimulating their circadian rhythm. And so it's really just hours of daylight versus any particular, UV light or anything like that.
Would you provide supplemental light in the winter time?
Correct. Yep, you could
Compensate. Like we probably need more.
Yeah, typically in the winter in this part of the country, they don't breed as well. And when our days started getting longer, then they'll breed well again. Folks who are doing production where they want to breed, 12 months of the year, typically will just keep it at 12 hours a day light and 12 hours of dark every day, and they'll breed all year long. Much easier. So as you're looking at different environments, you want them out of the wind and you want them out of the rain, because if they get wet and if they get wind on them, they're going to get chilled. So as long as they're dry and out of the wind, they can handle extremely cold temperatures. And make sure that they're not in direct sun anywhere. In the summer, that may mean providing some sort of shading, depending where they are. Be aware of predators. So domestic dogs, raccoons, possums, foxes, coyotes, all these sort of things. I think rabbits are just as tasty as we do. So, be aware of what predators are around and what you might need to do to make sure your animals are safe. A lot of people will just put something like chain link around their rabbit area, or put them in an enclosed building that they can close up at night. But it really depends on what your pressure is. Space requirements are, for an animal that produces as much meat as the rabbit can produce, are very minimal. A commercial size, so around a 10-pound rabbit, requires a 2-foot by 2-foot cage. They recommend at least 14 inches tall. I like to go with just a 2-foot cube for my males, and then my females that don't have litters on them. It's plenty of room for them to hop around and stretch and lay down and do all the things that rabbits do. Of course, you can go bigger if you want to and give them more space. When they have a litter on them, then I would recommend making it bigger. So that 2 feet deep, I have short arms. I'm not a tall person. So a 30-inch deep cage, I can't reach the back of. So I like a 2-foot deep cage that's about 3 feet wide. And that gives them more space to spread out. If they have a litter, or if you're growing out a litter of babies, it gives them plenty of room to grow until you're ready to process. One thing to be aware of when you're setting up your housing is that rabbits can be really territorial. And so if you have wire cages and they're touching each other, your rabbits may fight between the cages. And so you may need to leave a little gap or use a solid barrier, depending on what's easiest for you. Also, your males may spray urine. So that's something that they do to sort of mark their territory. And so just be aware of that as you're setting up your housing. You probably don't want your male spraying, on something that's really important to you or at a high enough level that he's going to spray on you. That's really unpleasant. So keep their behavior in mind as you think about the housing.
Keep them more ground.
Correct, I do, yeah. I also personally select for males that don't spray, which is something that is apparently heritable. Is I guess just how assertive they are about what's theirs. There are different ways to house rabbits. So you can have individual hutches where you have sort of a sleeping area for the rabbit that's connected to an outside sort of play bathroom area. And that works really well for a pet rabbit or a couple of rabbits in most cases. It can get messy if you've got a solid floor on the house part because rabbits aren't always terribly clean. Some are, some aren't. It depends on the rabbit. So individual hutches can work really well. It gives them the option to go inside if they want more protection and outside if they want to be outside. Stacking cages, you can see on this slide, there's the black ones where there are 3 cages, one on top of the other. Those are nice because they make really good use of limited space. So your tiny little footprint can have multiple cages in it. One thing you'll notice with this is there are trays underneath that have to be emptied pretty much every day in the area where the animal goes to the bathroom. So that is additional labor just to keep in mind, depending how many you have, that may add up. We like to use suspended cage banks. So I built banks of wire cages and they're just wire that are attached together. And then I suspend them from the ceiling. And so there's nothing there that can hold disease and all of the manure falls through to the ground. And so it's very clean, very sanitary, and gives the rabbits everything that they need. And I have them inside of sort of a, not terribly weatherproof, but a covered barn area. So that they're protected from the elements, even in those cages. And another thing folks always ask about is a colony setup. So we all have this image in our head of rabbits being in a big open space as a group, they're snuggling together and they're happy. And that can happen, but a lot of times it doesn't. So colony housing can be tricky. So remember earlier I said that rabbits are territorial. That can be one of the biggest limitations with colony housing because rabbits are social, but they are very territorial and they can be very aggressive with each other, especially females can be very territorial. Rabbits who are housed in groups are often more active and more content. And so from a social standpoint, it can be a very positive thing. But if you want to do colony housing, I would definitely recommend starting with young females because they'll be more likely to get along as they mature, or a mom with her daughters because they will generally get along well as they mature, but not always. So always be ready to remove animals from the situation if they don't get along, because you may have one that just starts trouble. As far as management, there are some issues. If you have rabbits who built their own sort of tunnel network, you may have a really hard time catching them. They may be really friendly, but some of them may not. And so if you need to catch them for any reason, if they need to be checked over if they're sick or injured, you may not be able to get them well. Or if there's any diseases that you need to check for, you may not be able to get your hands on them when you need to.
You're saying, so if you've got them housed in a area where there's ground.
Yeah, like a group area.
You could actually dig.
Oh yeah.
down
Oh, they can
under
dig.
the-
Yes. And that's one of the concerns is they can actually dig out.
Out.
Yes, they certainly can. And so
A particular back shed.
Yeah.
Line, but
they certainly can dig out. One thing people will sometimes do is take sort of the dirt out and dig down 6 inches or 12 inches and then basically make a wire barrier underneath and then put the dirt back in. And that can keep them from digging out, and that can work just fine. And so they're also, is sort of a difficulty with breeding sometimes. So if you let your male run full time with your females, they'll have litters whenever they feel like it, basically. You won't necessarily know when they're due or if they've had babies, because typically rabbits are really good at hiding their babies. You won't even know it happened. And then they'll come out, you know, with 4-week-old babies that you've never seen before, and who have never seen you and might be a little wild. And so that can be a downfall of colony housing. And so I recommend keeping the buck separate and breeding the does by hand as you want them bred, instead of just letting sort of nature take its course. And part of that is if the buck lives with the does full time, as soon as she's done having her babies, the buck will breed her again and she'll have another litter in 4 weeks. And so, again, rabbits' survival strategy is essentially make more babies faster. And so the more babies they have, the more likely some of them are going to live. And so, you know, in a wild setting. And so,
You're saying even in like in a colony setting, you would take the buck and maybe have that.
I would have him on his own
Stay
cage.
on its own.
I would, yes, I would have his own spot for the buck, and you could either put him with the does for, you know, a couple of days and he will happily breed any does you have, or you can bring the does to him one at a time and actually witness a breeding and then bring the does back to their colony, which is how I would recommend doing it if you were going to do it that way. With litters, does may actually help raise each other's litters. A lot of times, if they're due at the same time, they'll have their babies in the same nest. And so you might have, you know, 25, 30 babies in one nest. And that's a good and a bad, because they may nurse at the same time. So all the babies have plenty of milk, or one doe may nurse and she only has a set number of teats. And so you may get babies that actually starve because there's too many babies in one spot at the same time. So just be aware of that, and you probably won't be able to check on them if they can dig anywhere or get anywhere to hide them. And so you won't be able to really do anything about that situation.
Is it okay to have a screen for them to walk on all the time?
Mhm.
Or do you have to have some kind of flag?
Yeah.
Does it bother them?
Yeah, so in cages, if rabbits are in cages full time, then they're walking on a wire. I recommend a heavy gauge galvanized wire, a 1/2 inch by 1 inch, and rabbits are fully furred on the bottom of their feet, or should be. And so a rabbit that has good fur coverage won't have any irritation from being on that full time. And actually, typically, if they have a solid area in their cage, what they'll do is pee on it and then stand in the pee, which is actually worse for their feet than standing on the wire, even though it seems counterintuitive. Also, if you're going back to the litters, just one more concern is if you are tracking pedigrees, you won't know whose babies they are 90% of the time. So you will not be able to probably track pedigrees if your litters are being raised in a colony situation. A couple of things to think about with colony housing. You're not going to be able to sanitize it very well. If they're on the dirt, whatever bacteria or viruses or coccidia get in there, it's going to be really hard to clean them out without removing all the dirt and replacing it. They're going to go to the bathroom in one corner and they're going to walk through it, track over everywhere. Coccidia is a really big issue with rabbits that are raised in a colony setting. And in many livestock, coccidia causes digestive symptoms. In rabbits, it actually causes abscesses in the liver. And so it will extremely impact your growth rates and the health of your rabbits. And when you butcher your rabbits, your liver will have to be discarded because it'll be full of abscesses. So it can be a pretty big loss if you're raising them for meat, for sure, or for any purpose where you want them to stay really healthy. They also potentially have exposure to wild rabbits, depending on what your colony setup looks like. If they have access to where the wild rabbits are, or the other way around, the wild rabbits can spread fleas to them and coccidia. And in areas where there's rabbit hemorrhagic disease, they can spread that as well. And so just think about disease concerns if it's something you are considering. Maybe talk to people who are doing colony housing and see if they have any suggestions. What I'll say is, from my understanding, the people who have set up with colonies, usually the first couple of years it goes really well, and then you start having health issues. And that could probably be mitigated in different ways, but just something to be aware of.
Is that because of the dirt floor, or is that because of
Primarily.
together? But if you had like a mesh, like a colony.
Yeah, you could certainly have a group housing with a wire floor, and that would certainly eliminate a lot of the concerns there. The biggest thing is making sure there's enough space and enough sort of spots for them to get away from each other. And also, another issue with having all your rabbits in one group is if one rabbit gets sick, they're probably all going to get sick because they're all in contact with each other all the time. One thing I've seen that's sort of an intermediate is when folks use sort of rabbit tractors for grow outs, sort of like a chicken tractor. It's its own sort of freestanding root cage that you can move around through the grass if you want to, for your babies that you're growing out to process for meat. Because in that amount of time, typically they're not going to have issues from coccidia or anything in the amount of time they're growing out. It may reduce your growth rates a little bit, but it may add things that are more valuable to you, like having that animal have access to fresh green, greenery in different ways. So that can be sort of an intermediate to keep your breeders in raised pens, and then your grow outs you could put in a tractor situation. So back to manure for a minute, and there you can see a picture of a tomato, a volunteer tomato happily growing in a pile of nothing but rabbit manure. That was not planted intentionally, but it grew all on its own. A commercial size rabbit, a 9 to 10 pound rabbit, will produce a pound of manure per day, approximately. And so for a rabbit this size, that's a pretty good amount of manure. There is a big difference. The manure, like I said, is dry and pretty much odorless. The urine is not. The urine has a high calcium content, and it will scale onto any surface that it lands on, especially metal surfaces. So you can get a calcium buildup and a smell from that. So that's something to be aware of. Again, when you're setting it up, you probably don't want to put them right backed up to your house and end up with the rabbits peeing on the side of your building, because it can be hard to get rid of. As far as collection, people have lots of different strategies. The way that we do it is we, like I said, have the suspended cages, the manure falls down, and then we just shovel it. There's a couple of examples here where folks have set up different manure collection strategies. And so you can see I don't know how well you can see, but in the pictures, there's essentially an angled roofing material or plastic material or something that funnels everything to one side of the cages. And then the top one has some PVC that's angled, so everything runs off to one side into a bin. The other one, it collects in the middle in a big bin. And a lot of people will put almost a double collection system. So they'll have a container that everything falls into, but the urine can either soak through or go into a secondary container. So you can separate the manure from the urine. So you can use your manure for application immediately if you want to. But whatever you decide to do, have a plan for your manure. Again, if you have trays in stacking cages, you're going to have to empty those very frequently. You're going to be handling this big awkward tray and trying not to dump it on yourself, which from firsthand experience I can say is unpleasant at best if it's full of urine. So I don't tend to prefer trays, but in a limited space situation, it may be the best option. So one thing I've seen people do is actually take like a hutch or a cage and put it directly over a garden bed for the off season and let the rabbits just go to the bathroom in the thing all winter, in the garden all winter, and then just sort of spread it out in the spring and move the rabbits off. And so they've deposited the manure right where you want it. You don't have to move it. And you can grow right in it as soon as it's growing season. Another thing you can do is put a smaller collection bin. The rabbits typically will have one corner they pick as their bathroom, sometimes two if the cage is bigger. And you can typically put a bin in that corner, and 90% of the excrement will end up in that bin, and you can just clean the bin out. You can litter train them, but again, you've got to change it every day because they're going to fill it up because they are going to the bathroom quite a bit. There are obviously lots of ways that you can deal with it, but just think about what you're going to want to do on a daily basis, how much time you're going to want to spend picking up manure at the end of your day. And then have a plan for what you're going to do with your manure. Do you want to directly apply it? Do you want to compost it? Do you want to grow worms in it? Because that's another option too, is folks who do bins underneath the cages, turn them into worm bins and just put the worms right in. As long as the urine can seep through, it won't overwhelm the worms. And then the worms will break down that rabbit manure for you. And you'll have rabbit manure and worm castings to put on your garden, which your garden will very much thank you for. Rabbits have very sensitive digestive systems. They are very prone to GI stasis and other issues, especially around weaning time. But anytime that their diet significantly changes, it can actually kill them. And there's not really a lot you can do about it once they've hit that point. So the main thing I would recommend is having a formulated ration as the base of their diet, whether that is a pelleted ration or a custom mixed ration, but I recommend a pellet because they can't sift through and just pick out what they want to eat. Like toddlers, they'll pick out the candy and leave the vegetables, you know. Typically, you would feed about an ounce of feed per pound of body weight on an adult rabbit. When they're nursing, you would feed free choice, so they may eat 3 or 4 times that, depending how many babies they're raising. Most rabbit feed is either a 16% protein or an 18% protein. If you have, you know, mature animals that are just in maintenance and not really doing a whole lot, the 16% should be more than adequate. If you're raising babies, 18% will get you faster growth rates. They will utilize all of that protein and put it right into meat. Everyone has their own favorite brand of rabbit food. And what works for me may not be the best for my neighbor, you know, and part of that is generations of rabbits just being raised on the same feed and really honing in the genetics to work well with that feed. And so when you buy your rabbits, I would ask them what they're feeding. And if you can use the same feed, you'll probably have better results.
So are you basically having one brand of feed that you're using for other rabbits?
Yep. Yeah, we do. We use a 16% for everything on our farm because we do have the mini Rex too, and they will get absurdly fat on an 18% protein. And so we feed sort of in the middle. So our growth rates could be a little better if we switched those, but where my kids generally take care of them, it's easier to have just one type of feed. But yeah, I would pick a brand, stick to that brand. And if you switch, so if you buy rabbits and you can't get the same brand or find something you like better, make the change gradually, you know, over several days so that you're fading out the old stuff and adding the new stuff so that they make that transition well.
And you don't have them then out grazing and
we don't put our rabbits out grazing. With our young rabbits, sometimes our kids will take out a litter and set up like an X pen and let them sort of pick through things and socialize with them and things like that. But we don't have anything set up where I have them out grazing, mostly for disease concerns.
Do you like the like in the off season for the cage on the garden or whatever, and if you have like cover crops growing, would that make sense to actually like supplement their diet?
It certainly can, yeah.
And then you would just like adjust, like go down pellets.
Yeah, so I would recommend actually offering them the same amount of pellets and then just adding in what other feed you want to add in. Because they'll eat the pellets as they need it. And if they're getting enough nutrition from the other stuff, they probably will just eat less of what you offer them for pellets. The key thing when you pick your feed is to find something that's readily accessible that's going to be fresh. You don't want to go to Tractor Supply and buy the bag of rabbit food that's been on their shelf for 3 years. It's not going to have the vitamins in it. It's not going to have the nutrition in it that you want. There are a couple of companies that have organic rabbit feed. And so you can certainly look into availability and pricing. Typically, they're very expensive. But you know, depending on what's important to you, that may be worthwhile. Just make sure that it's something you can get fresh, that it hasn't been sitting. That would be my caution. I like to offer hay at different times. So if you bring new rabbits home, offering some dry hay to them, just a grass hay, will help keep their digestive system working well. If you notice they start to, you know, their stool looks a little funny, I would take the grain away completely and just put them on hay for a little while, get their system back so it's okay, and then add the grain back a little bit at a time. And when I say grain, I don't mean whole grains, I mean like a pelleted ration. But your hay is going to improve your gut health. It will decrease your growth rates a little bit if you feed hay. The more hay you feed, the less grain they're going to eat, so they'll grow slower. And so I feed it in limited quantities, but especially around weaning time. And if there's any stress for that rabbit, like if I bring a rabbit to a show, they have hay all the time at the show and when I get home for a couple of days. And like I said, feeding hay around weaning can help reduce digestive issues. And a lot of people want to know, what can I feed my rabbit for treats or supplemental nutrition? And moderation is really your key. For an adult rabbit, a few tablespoons a day is plenty. And things that are good include things like celery, apples, bananas, bean sprouts, green beans, cucumbers, strawberries, watermelon. They love the rinds, blueberries, beet greens. So all sorts of different things. There are some things that really are not good for them. And so, you know, a lot of people say carrots. Well, carrots are okay. Carrots have a lot of sugar in them. So a little disc of a carrot is plenty. Carrot greens, go nuts. You can give them as much as you want and they'll do great. But there are lots of resources online for different things that you can use for treats. I would recommend shying away from your house rabbit resources and shying towards your more production rabbit resources, because they're going to be focused on nutrition, not just feel good. And so as you're looking at different resources, think about the source of that information. And getting into alternative feeds, things like harvested greens, dandelion, green and flowers, they love them, dill, parsley. You can grow fodder for your rabbits. There's all sorts of different options on ways to supplement their feed or, you know, reduce the amount of pellet you're feeding. But the big thing is just making sure they're getting the nutrition that they need. So water. Water is the most important nutrient for all animals, for all life, as far as that goes. A lot of people use dishes, and if you have a few rabbits, that works fine. I would recommend heavyweight crocks so they can't tip them over, because the first thing a rabbit will do when you put something new in their cage is grab it and flip it over or throw it across their cage. They like to play with things. And our rabbits, a lot of them have little cat toy balls in their cages or pieces of wood or whatever, so that they can play with something. And they throw them all over the place, but they will do that with your dishes too. And in the winter, those will freeze. And so you'll have to either have a second set of dishes or be able to get the ice out and give them fresh water. We use an automatic watering system, which is wonderful about 9 months of the year. They go through a lot more water, they grow a lot faster, they're a lot healthier when they have access to fresh water. The watering system, they can't get anything into it, so it's always clean, it's always fresh. So we use it gravity fed. There's nipple waterers like the picture that's here. We use sort of a combination with a nipple waterer that actually has a little collection bowl underneath, because some rabbits will just sit there and run it and, you know, drink a drop or two, but they'll end up with a puddle under their cage. So we use the bowl sort of as a combination, and it wastes a lot less water that way. A doe with a litter can drink up to a gallon of water a day. So if you have a little 16-ounce crock, you're going to be filling that several times, or having multiple ones in there. And if they, you know, the baby's pooping it or they get food in it, they may not drink it. So your best bet is generally an automatic system of some sort, whether it's a water bottle or just a gravity fed system with a line. And then in the winter, obviously this part of the country, most years it gets cold. This year we haven't had as much trouble, but in general, they do make circulated heated systems that you can use. In the winter, we typically just water with warm water twice a day, and you can pour it right on the ice that's in there. It'll melt the ice, they'll drink it. And realistically, the rabbits will lick and chew the ice for some amount, but I wouldn't rely on that for their water consumption needs. There are some things that you'll need to do management-wise with rabbits. Trimming toenails is going to be the big one, especially with rabbits that are housed in a wire cage, because they're not going to have anything to wear their toenails out on. So that's something that you'll have to do on a regular basis. Depending on your breed, grooming may be a big part of your day, or it may not happen at all. With the Rexes, you don't groom them. With an Angora, you're going to need to spend some time grooming. Toys, like I mentioned, you can have all kinds of different toys, you know, bells or pieces of wood. They love fruit trees like apple trees, any kind of stone fruit, the wood from the tree. They absolutely love them. They're great for their teeth. They don't have to have them to maintain their teeth, but it certainly, you know, helps their overall mentality and, you know, their satisfaction level, I think, to have things to chew on and throw around. One thing I forgot to mention on the nutrition is a lot of people ask about the mineral wheels. They don't need those. All they're going to do is destroy the galvanize on your wire. you're better off to just give the rabbit something fun to play with, because that's why they're playing with it, is because it's fun. Their nutrition, their pelleted ration should contain all the minerals that they need, and you don't need to add any additional mineral wheel or anything like that. A lot of folks add resting mats to the cages, and that way they have a spot to get off the wire. I like you can get ceramic tiles to put in, and in the summer that'll help keep them cool because they stay cool. If you have really messy rabbits that are just going to go to the bathroom on it, I would just take it out, because it'll be a constant battle and they don't have to have it. If you have rabbits that aren't going to make a mess out of it and enjoy it, then go for it. You can use a piece of wood, and then you get 2 birds with 1 stone with a clean rabbit. They've got something to chew on and something to lay on and stand on. Health checks. So you want to check your rabbits over. Make sure you don't have ear mites. You make sure you don't have lice popping up, or fleas, or sore hawks, or any of these other things that rabbits can get. You just want to make sure your rabbits are healthy and doing well. If you're keeping track of pedigrees in any way, whether it's formally or just for your own breeding purposes, tattooing is very simple, very easy way to keep track of which rabbit is which, because once you hit a certain point, you're going to not remember whether this is fluffy or floofy, and not be able to remember, did I switch their cages, or are they the right cages? Or if you have kids like I do, sometimes they take 2 rabbits out and put them back in the wrong cages. So the tattoos are a fail-proof pretty much way of doing that. You can either use a clamp style tattoo, or we use a tattoo pen, and I use a numbing spray. They hardly notice, to be honest. So I would definitely recommend that, so that you can keep records on what's going on with your rabbits. One thing that you'll need to do is when your rabbits molt, which is a fancy word for shedding in rabbits, basically what they do is they take their whole coat and just throw it all over the cage. So you just end up with what looks like a giant cobweb of a cage. And so once they're done shedding, I like to use a pressure washer and just wash everything, take the rabbits out of the cage, obviously, and then take the whole cage outside, pressure wash the whole thing, and bring it back into a nice clean cage. And that has the added benefit of, if there's any manure that's built up, gotten caught with the fur on the bottom of the cage, and then the manure's gotten caught, it'll wash that off too, and give them a nice clean environment. But it can look a little scary when they molt, just your whole barn. You go out one day and all of a sudden there's just fur everywhere. And that you can't tell, because the rabbits, of course, have a full coat of fur still. Breeding. So you've got healthy rabbits, and now you've decided you want more rabbits. So you're going to need to breed your rabbits. There's different strategies for breeding. Whatever, whether you're doing colony raising or individual housing, always recommend bringing the female to the male's cage. Females are extremely territorial. If you bring a male to a female's cage, she may be fine, or she may kill him, castrate him, injure him. They can be extremely aggressive, and they can do a lot of damage very fast. So always bring the female to the male. And the male will happily do his job and then go back to sleep. So like we mentioned, rabbits are harder to breed with shorter daylight hours. And so the saying of, they breed like rabbits may not always hold true. You'd be amazed how frustrating it can be to try to breed rabbits when they don't feel like it. And it will happen. You can try for your first breeding with a female between 7 and 10 months, depending on the adult size of the rabbit. The males typically take about a month longer than the females to reach sexual maturity. So as you're buying your starter trio, if you're buying a 3-month-old male, realize he may not be ready to breed for 7 months. So it may take a while. And then, rabbits can, like I said, have a litter every 32 days if they're in with a male. It is not ideal for the female, obviously, and you will be replacing your female very quickly if you allow that to happen. And so I recommend, at a minimum, having her have her babies and not breed her again until they get to 8 weeks old for most people. A lot of people like to wait a little bit longer and give her a chance to recover her body condition. I will say fat rabbits, female rabbits, do not breed well. Fat male rabbits either, for that matter. But if your female rabbit is not pregnant and is not raising babies, do not give her extra food, or you probably won't get more babies from her.
Okay, yes, you're right. I really have to manage the feeding.
You do.
It's just not, you just don't give unlimited access to.
As some people do, with varying levels of success. I think it depends a bit on the breed of rabbit and the intensity of your breeding schedule. So, you know, if you're having a litter from that doe 5 or 6 times a year, it's probably fine to keep her on free feed if she's really keeping with that production cycle. But otherwise, she's likely to get fat and reduce her reproductive rate. And people always ask me about inbreeding with rabbits. People will come to me and they want a trio for breeding, but they want a male that's not related to the females. And rabbits are one of the most resilient species to inbreeding. I think the statistics are you can inbreed direct siblings for like 80 generations before you have any negative consequence from it. And so I actually prefer to inbreed my rabbits to some level because you get much more consistent offspring. And so that's part of when I said, if you're looking at breeders, I would buy them all from one breeder. Even if they're, you know, all of the same dad. If you breed those 3 together, you're going to get babies that are going to look like the 3 you bought. If you buy rabbits that are crossbreeds between 2 different breeds, and then you cross them together, you're going to get a menagerie of different styles, sizes, looks, growth rates, and not have consistency. And so inbreeding actually is not a negative with rabbits as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, if you see reduced growth rates or ill thrift or small litter sizes, maybe bring in some new genetics. But on the whole, inbreeding is a good strategy for most rabbits, I think, to some degree. Kindling is a really fancy word for rabbits giving birth. Their babies are called kits or kittens, and kindling is the fancy word. But when they give birth, you want to have a nest box available to them 28 days after you breed them. Most likely they won't have their babies till 31 days, but it's always good to have it there a little bit early. They will, if you give them the hay, they will gather the hay and they will make their own nest. They will pull fur. I like to put a little bit of shavings in the bottom just to absorb any moisture. And then let the rabbit do what they do for the rest of it. This is a metal nesting box that you see there. Advantages obviously is they're easy to sanitize. They're commercially available. You can get the size that you want and you can have it immediately without having to do any extra work. You just have to pay a little bit for them. One nice thing with them is they're a standardized size. And so if you have a 9-pound rabbit, you buy this nest box for a 9-pound rabbit, it's the right size. She's not going to hang out in there and poop and pee. She's just going to go in, feed her babies, get back out. A lot of them have what they call a kit scraper. And so the lip that the mother rabbit jumps over, when she's nursing her babies, they will be attached quite well. And if there's not a kit scraper, she can actually jump out with babies still attached to her and end up with them on the wire where they can die from exposure. Because a rabbit is not actually able to move their babies. They can't pick them up and put them back in the nest the way a dog or a cat or something else would. So wherever their babies are, that's where they stay. So you want to keep them in the nest because they'll stay warm. They'll all snuggle together.
Is there anything about handling the kit?
Yeah, that's definitely, that'll come up in just a second as far as handling. So again, 28 days to 32 days is typically your window. After 35 days, I would assume that she doesn't have babies in her belly, and you would breed her again. As far as nursing, you probably won't see your rabbit nursing almost ever. They nurse their babies 1 to 2 times a day, typically for less than 10 minutes. They'll go in, they'll feed them, they'll leave. If they're really good moms, they'll cover the nest back up like they were never there. And so the best thing to do is check the babies to make sure their bellies are full of milk, because you're probably not going to ever see her feed them. And once nursing is established, I would give mom as much food as she wants until the point where you wean those babies. So there are a few things about first-time moms that I think are important. First-time moms are not always the best. Sometimes they make a nest and then have the babies on the wire. Sometimes they make a nest on the wire and have the babies in it and they just die from exposure, basically. If you're there, you could probably move everything to the nest and into the nest box, and hopefully she'll take care of them. Some of them forget to feed them. Some of them, you know, just aren't good moms. And most breeders will use what we call a 3-strike rule. The first time, if she loses her babies, it's sort of not unexpected, let's say. If she loses them 3 times, most breeders will boot her out. I'm a little more picky. If she gets to twice and isn't taking care of her babies, I have somebody else who can take that cage space, and she looks really good in a crock pot. You know, I'm very practical with that as far as our rabbits go. Chilled kits, if you also happen to raise poultry, chilled kits warm up really well in an incubator. So I've used that multiple times. It's got nice moisture level and the heat, and they revive really quickly. Another trick is always, at least for us women, if we have a bra, stuff them right in. You know, you gentlemen don't have quite the same advantage of having something to hold the babies, but skin to skin with babies, just like with baby, you know, with infants, it will warm them up faster than anything else. I will say, you know, some chilled kits you can revive and they do great. A lot of times I find if a kit is chilled, it's prone to being chilled again, and a lot of times you'll lose them anyway. So if you revive kits, just realize that they still might not make it, and sort of prepare yourself for that, because a lot of people get sort of upset about that, and understandably, I don't know if they're cute because they're born hairless, but they're cute within a few days. But it's always hard to lose babies, especially if they're your first litter. Some moms, especially first-time moms, can overgroom babies. And so they'll clean them, and clean their ears off, or clean their feet off, or clean their tail off, anything that sticks off. And so occasionally you may, if you notice that, have to actually take the litter out of the cage until mom sort of chills out, her hormones drop down a little bit, and then you can put them back typically. Which leads us to shelving, which is a fancy word for basically taking the entire nest box out of the cage. If it's not terribly awful weather and your rabbits are in an enclosed environment, you can just set the nest box right on top of mom's cage and just put the box back in twice a day for mom to feed them while you're doing your other chores, if there's a reason that she can't be with them full time. And they do fine. Like I said, they really only go to the babies once or twice a day. They don't really care if you take them, because when they're not feeding them, they pretend they don't exist. Just like a wild rabbit essentially just abandons her babies, except when she's feeding them. If you do lose a litter, your best bet is to just breed that female again immediately. She will be receptive as soon as she's done giving birth. If for whatever reason the babies are stillborn or born on the wire and die from exposure, you can rebreed her the same day, the next day, and she'll kindle again a month later. And that's typically the best way to ensure that she rebreeds. Sometimes if we wait, it can be harder to breed them. So checking on kits, which brings us to your question about handling. There's a lot of information out there that says if you touch baby rabbits, the mother rabbit will not take care of them. Really, that is something that is a really good disincentive for people not to touch wild rabbits and wild animal babies in general, because it keeps people from putting their smell on them and keeps people from wanting, I guess, to, keeps people from wanting to touch the babies. In reality, with domestic rabbits, they're used to your smell. Everything in their cage smells like you. If you touch their babies, they don't care at all. We go in as soon as the females are done having their babies. We know there's babies in there. We take the box right out. We pull the fur off. We count how many babies. If there's any dead ones, we take them out immediately. If we have 2 does that kindle at the same time, you can actually foster kits. So if I have 1 litter of 4 and 1 litter of 14, I'll probably balance it out. So each mom has a little bit better chance of having evenly sized kits. And another thing that you're doing, I like to go in at least once a day and check the kits for the first few days. And when you pick them out at the very beginning, that top left picture is right away. They're pretty much completely hairless. And when you hold them, if you look at their belly, if they've eaten, you'll see a big white patch in their belly. You'll see the milk right through their skin because they're basically see-through at that point. And so it's really nice assurance that mom is feeding them. They're all doing well. If there's a couple that aren't eating well, sometimes it makes sense to again, balance out a litter with somebody else. You can hold mom and feed the babies, but it's not always easy. But at least you'll be aware of what's going on. And if mom's not feeding them at all, then you know that right up front. Whether you have another female you could put them with, but checking on them in that way is always good. So cleanliness is really important in your nest box. You've got this sort of enclosed space, it's warm, it's humid, and if your female is in there soiling the nest box, it's gonna get gross really fast. The female will keep the babies, they won't go to the bathroom except when they're nursing, and she'll stimulate them all to go to the bathroom, she'll clean it up. So the babies themselves don't really generate the mess, it's the mom in some cases. And so typically I like to change out the bedding once the kids have fur. I like to leave the clean fur that the mom has pulled and take the rest of the bedding out if there's any dampness to it, just so the babies stay healthy. And then I remove the nest box at about 14 days. That keeps the babies healthy. At that point, they're fully furred. They don't need the nest box. An intermediate that we sometimes do, especially in the winter, is I'll actually just take the metal boxes we use have a floor on them. I'll take the floor out and take the bedding out and let the kits still have this nest box to gather in, but there's nothing there to catch any of the material that can make them unwell. If you do leave your nest box in longer, it can be fine if it's clean. Around that age, the babies will start going to the bathroom on their own and they will do it in the box. They can end up having respiratory issues just from the ammonia from the urine in the box. And they can also end up with what's called nest box eye, which essentially is an infection in their eye just from having all that material so close to their faces and having the irritation. So I would recommend making sure that it's clean in your nest box as much as possible. As far as development, like I said, they're born blind, deaf, hairless, completely helpless. Essentially, their front legs are really well developed for pulling the rest of their body. Nothing else really works except their mouth. They're basically just little nursing machines, and they'll nurse and then they'll pull themselves all back into a little pile and they'll be warm until mom comes back. And as they grow, around 2 days old, they start getting fur. They're much cuter at that point forward. Around 10 days, their eyes and their ears are open. And between 10 days and 2 weeks is probably about the cutest you can have for a baby bunny. They're about this big, you can hold them, and they're just ridiculously cute. We call them the popcorn stage at that point, because if you touch them, they just sort of jump like spastically. They're super cute. And they start exploring their environment and they start eating feed at about 2 weeks old. At about 4 weeks, that would be the earliest age I would recommend weaning. If you can, I would recommend going further. You're going to limit the incidence of any digestive issues. 6 to 8 weeks would be my recommended weaning age. Typically what I do is in a bigger litter, I pull the males first to prevent any breeding of the males back to their mother, because occasionally some of those males can be precocious. If you want them for breeding, a lot of times they won't breed till 10 months old. But if it's their own mother, then sometimes at 8 weeks old, you can end up with a pregnancy. And so I typically will pull all my males at the beginning and sort of let mom moderate her milk production down a little bit. And then if there's a couple that are a little smaller, maybe I'll leave them in a little bit longer. So I like to do it sort of gradually. Some people just cold turkey take them all, mom dries up, it's fine. I just feel like it's less stressful to do it in smaller groups. 8 weeks old would be the earliest to rehome your babies. And that is actually by law in this state and most states in the US, that they cannot go to new homes before 8 weeks old. And at that point, their digestive system should be functioning very well. They'll be on full feed. They should be able to be away from mom with no problem. And someone always asks me, should I use a heat lamp in the winter? No, don't use a heat lamp. So your rabbit that's covered in fur has just pulled off an entire blanket, wrapped it around these warm babies. As long as they're fed, they will be just fine. And if they're not fed, putting a heat lamp on them will not help. It'll actually make it so that they dehydrate faster because they'll be too warm. And actually in the summer, a lot of times I'll go in and take a lot of the fur out because the babies will get too hot. So you don't need supplemental heat, even if you're having babies when it's 10 degrees below zero. They will be toasty warm. Again, weaning. So between 5 or 6 and 8 weeks, depending on how big your babies are, how big your litters are, and how fast you want another litter. You know, and it depends when you rebred your mother. Sometimes, you know, if you have a doe who has 4 or 5 kits in a litter, at 4 weeks old, you may want to rebreed her and get another litter from her in another month. Because it's not going to take a whole lot from her to raise 4 babies or 5 babies. And so if you're looking for more production, you may want to breed her quickly, and then you may want to wean your babies a little bit earlier. So if you bred her when the babies were 4 weeks old, when they're 8 weeks old, she's going to be having another litter. So by 6 weeks old, I would say take the babies out in that case. And they're going to be well grown at that point, being just a few babies on one mom. And again, you want to separate the males before they breed their mother. That's always a key. And again, I talked a little bit about the process already that I typically use. Weaning enteritis is a big fancy term basically for babies that around weaning time, they can't handle the transition from being with mom to being on food, and they'll end up with diarrhea. A lot of times you'll see bloated bellies. Typically, in my experience, it happens because they're not getting what they need from mom before you wean them. So when they're with the mom, rabbits produce a special type of manure that actually has a lot of beneficial bacteria in it. And typically they eat it directly from the vent. And so when the babies are with mom, typically they're also eating it from mom. And if they miss that, that can, in my experience, be a precursor to weaning enteritis. That's one of those things that is difficult to correct if you have it with your babies. Again, I would take away the grain, give them hay, and just treat them with kid gloves. You know, hopefully they'll make it, but they may not, and they may never grow well. Again, selling kits, if you're selling babies, they have to be at least 8 weeks old. And then when you rebreed your mom is up to you. She's going to be the most likely to conceive while she's nursing or immediately when you take those babies away. If you give her that break in between, she is less likely to conceive on that first attempted breeding. Sexing kits is always something that people have a hard time with. And for good reason. Especially when you have a little bitty bunny, it's hard to necessarily tell the difference. So what I like to do is I like to kind of hold them in my arm. If they're relatively mellow, kind of cradle their head right here and give them a little bit of pressure so they don't struggle. And you can hold their butt in your hand. And then you can hold the tail between depending on how dexterous you are, between either your thumb and your first finger or your first finger and your middle finger. And you want to actually kind of pull down away from their belly with their tail. And that's going to take the whole vent and anus and pull it towards the back end of the bunny. And then you can take your other hand and actually apply pressure in front of the vent, and that'll expose the genitals. And so in the pictures that you see here, the one on the left is a female, and the one on the right is a male. And in a juvenile male, the penis itself won't expose. What you'll actually see is just a tube. And so if it looks like a little circle, like a burrito, a lot of people will call it, it's a male. And the one on the left, you can see a lot of people will call it a taco. And essentially it's a slit there that you'll see, and that'll be a female. And depending on your experience level, you may be able to tell this from about 3 weeks old, sometimes a little earlier, but I wouldn't count on it. I like to sex them at about 5 or 6 weeks, tattoo everybody, and then I like to sex them again when I split them into their grow out groups, because occasionally there's one that I've missexed. But it is something that takes some practice, both the technique of externalizing the vent, but also, just learning to tell the difference. And one tip I would give you is when you get your rabbits from the breeder, ask them to show you how to sex them. You get 2 benefits. You get to see it in person, and when they sex them, if they've sexed them wrong before you buy them, before you take them home. So you get the right rabbits. I know we're just about at the end of time, I apologize, but when we get to harvesting, typically you're shooting for around 5 pounds, which generally happens around 8 to 12 weeks, depending on your breed and management. If you're looking for pelts, most people shoot for 16 weeks. And with a Rex rabbit, for example, if you're doing a pelt, typically they'll take 16 weeks to get that additional weight because they're not quite as fast growing of a rabbit. And to me, we raise our own meat for a lot of reasons, but food security to me is one of the main tenets of self-sufficiency, and you have full control over the quality of your meat and the care that that animal received while it was growing. In my experience, they're easier to process than chickens. There's no plucking. I can take a rabbit from live to that picture in the top right-hand corner in less than 15 minutes. There's no smell, there's no feathers, there's no yuck. They're super easy. You know, that said, it's not for everyone. And so it may be something you can do, it may be something you can't do. And you may be able to network with other folks that raise rabbits, and you know, maybe one person processes rabbits for everybody and you guys work out some sort of agreement. Maybe one partner in a partnership is able to do it and the other's not. But you know, definitely if you can do it, it's something that is an art to learn how to do in a humane way and in a way where you really are producing the best quality meat for yourself and your family. Excuse me?
What's the technique for?
So there's different techniques. I use cervical dislocation, which is basically a fancy way of saying I sever the spinal cord without actually severing the skin. And so it renders them senseless immediately. And then I'm able to bleed out the rabbit. There will be some nerve activity, just like with any animal. And then I use a gambrel where I hook the back legs, cut down the middle of the back legs, and the skin basically just peels off. The biggest thing when you're butchering is when you first open the abdominal cavity, they will have a little sack of urine in there, in their bladder. You do not want that to bust open in your rabbit. And so that's the first thing I remove. And after that, I mean, it's super easy. You know, it's something you can do with nothing more than a knife. And like I said, it takes me less than 15 minutes to do a rabbit. And so definitely something that takes practice, and there's lots of YouTube videos, and I'm happy to offer advice offline to anybody who's interested. But I know we're over, but if anybody has questions, I'm happy to field those.
I have a question. What were the
Yeah.
seasons you're concerned about for pasture rabbits?
Yeah, so pasture rabbits, the big one is coccidia, because they're going to be hopping around in their own manure, potentially wild rabbit manure. Any exposure to any other animal potentially has the risk for disease. You know, fleas are minor, but they can have a big impact on your growth rates and animal care, or your animal sort of quality of life. You can get rabbit hemorrhagic disease in certain parts of the country. Knock on wood, we haven't seen it here yet in the wild population, but you know, without having the extreme temperatures, it could happen. You know, big things like I was mentioning earlier with colony situations or pasture situations. If you have group housing, if you get something like snuffles, it can go through everybody before you realize it. And now you've lost your entire population instead of just one rabbit that was isolated that you can remove from your population. You know, same thing with vent disease, that can be spread just through contact with each other. And so if they're grooming each other or females mounting each other, anything like that, which is normal behavior, it can spread things like vent disease, ear mites, fur mites, all that sort of stuff. Anything one rabbit has, they'll all have, essentially, is the biggest concern. But coccidia, to me, is the biggest thing that is different from having conventionally housed rabbits versus pastured rabbits. Yeah. Snuffles in rabbits, it's Pasteurella, and essentially it causes sneezing, watery eyes, pneumonia. It's extremely transmissible between rabbits. It's essentially always fatal. Occasionally you get an animal that recovers that then carries it and sheds it, but seems healthy, which is to me actually worse. And so it is something that rabbits are very prone to. And so when you bring in rabbits, if you go to a rabbitry and you hear a single sneeze, I would be on edge for sure. Rabbits don't typically sneeze unless they've just not had water and all of a sudden gotten water and got water in their nostrils. They shouldn't be sneezing at all. And so that's typically your telltale sign. One thing you can do is actually take a rabbit once you've learned how and actually turn it upside down and then turn it right side up. And if they do have any sort of respiratory stuff going on, a lot of times that'll trigger them to start sneezing. And so just something to think about, you know, as you're looking at rabbits, if you are concerned. But any wateriness on the eyes, any sort of discharge that's dried on the inside of the forelegs from them wiping their face, would definitely be red flags for me if I was looking at rabbits.
You can eat them after.
Oh, yeah.
they die of that?
I wouldn't do it after they die of it. I would cull them and then eat them. But I would not wait for them to die from it. And certainly if I had, you can have a whole rabbitry where 90% of them are healthy and you have just a couple that are showing signs of it. And so in that case, you may just remove the ones that have the most susceptibility to it, but realize that it may be present in your entire rabbitry, just not symptomatic. And so it's something that you can test for. Most people don't. Most people just call animals if they look like they possibly could have it, just to prevent any issues.
So people called on the site.
Typically, yeah. I mean, if you bring in new rabbits that aren't all from the same farm, I would strongly recommend quarantining your rabbits for about a month and make sure they're healthy before you get them near your other rabbits. And in that time period, you should be able to see if they're going to have anything crop up that you weren't expecting. Any other questions?
How many rabbits do you have at a given time?
Right now, I have no idea. I'm going to say 35-ish, maybe. I know how many cages I have. I try not to.
Not that you can't necessarily know.
I try not to count babies until they're weaned. But about 35, give or take. And that's a mix, probably 2/3 American chinchillas and the other 3rd is mini Rex that our kids raise.
Right, and you've got other animals.
We do, yeah, we've got a big farm.
Here.
Yeah.
Whole thing going.
We do, we've got a little bit of everything, yep.
Do you know anybody that actually like, so they create heat where they live, obviously, right? And so if you had like a colony of seedlings without heat mats, could you possibly like create a system where like the heat created from the rabbits?
Is utilized, sure, yeah, the question was about using the heat that rabbits generate to sort of help generate heat for your heat mats if you're starting seedlings. And I think you probably could to some degree. The downside is it's not going to be a consistent heat across the entire area. Where, you know, if you have a hutch or something, the rabbit is mostly going to be warm in the sort of enclosed area. And also you may not have good natural light, so you may have to provide artificial lighting. So that's an added thought. It certainly is a few degrees warmer. You know, I know that on nights where we get down into the mid-20s, our watering system doesn't freeze. So it's above freezing, but I don't know, you know, I haven't done anything to measure, you know, in the spring, how much warmer it might be. But certainly between the rabbits themselves and the manure, there's some amount of warmth being generated, but I don't know if it would be enough for heat mats where you typically want to be up 75, 80 degrees for most things. Any other questions?
Do you sell rabbits?
We do, yeah. Yeah, we can be, that's our website up on the slide, and any questions that you have, whether you're looking for rabbits or whether, you know, you're looking for advice on how to set things up or where to find the rabbits that you're looking for, you know, I'm happy to help out and offer advice. And yes, we do typically have rabbits available to answer that question, especially, you know, in early spring, early summer, late spring is typically when we have the most availability of weanling rabbits, so for either processing or for breeding. Yep. Cool.
Great.
Well, thank you all. I definitely appreciate everyone who's joined. And like I said, if you have questions, feel free to reach out at any time. And thank you again for having me.
Great, thanks,
Thank
Sarah.
you.
Thank you, Sarah.